Neverending Nightmares, originally released in September of 2014 through indie developer Infinitap Games, is an experience that genuinely wants to hurt you. Whether or not you're a fan of indie or horror games, you've probably already heard about this one before, and if you have, you're probably thinking, why? Why am I bothering to talk about this game now? Next to the multi-million view let's plays, reactions, reviews and streams, this game has been covered to death. So what else could a tiny YouTube reviewer have to say about it? Well, regardless of whether or not I can make this video original enough, I have to make it. Because during its greatest moments, this game terrified me. On the surface, Neverending Nightmares doesn't exactly look like much from a horror point of view. Being visually inspired by the works of Edward Gorey, it certainly doesn't appear to be anything more than a wonderfully presented hand-drawn side-scroller. Everything around the main character simply oozes personality through its style, and while it is a little bleak due to a lack of colour, it's hardly scary at first glance. In fact, to tell you the truth, it was with an immediately intoxicating fascination that my journey with Neverending Nightmares actually began. The seemingly late 1800s inspired environmental design offers a really interesting backdrop to the story, one that wouldn't at all be surprising if it appeared within a Tim Burton movie, and this feels particularly appropriate to note when taking into consideration the art direction, which can at times also share some small similarities with Burton's signature style, although not nearly to the same extent that would come to heavily inspired Don't Starve, a game that was released only a year prior in April of 2013. For this reason, Neverending Nightmares feels incredibly handcrafted from a visual point of view, and the main character's sluggish movement as he plods back and forth with awkward marionette steps really hammers this feeling home. It's almost as if he himself is nothing more than a puppet being directed past paper backgrounds and cardboard cutout furniture. And to touch on the player's control of the main character for a moment, this is something about the game that has been criticised in the past as feeling a little bit janky, or even just being straight up poorly developed. And after playing Neverending Nightmares, this honestly doesn't surprise me, because for the most part, it's true. And in some ways, the game is better for it. To explain this, let me first offer some initial context on the game's story. You take control of Thomas, a young man who, after waking from a particularly gruesome nightmare, immediately strikes the player as a nervous, worrisome character. Now sure, you could blame the nightmare for this, but it quickly becomes apparent that regardless of any familiarity that he might have with his surroundings, he's not at home here. He may have awoken in a comfortable bedroom bathed in candlelight, but if any of this is offered a single shred of comfort, Thomas doesn't show it. Instead, notice how his eyes rapidly scan every room for any signs of interest or more likely danger, or the blank, almost disinterested facial expression that likely masks an extremely alert disposition in spite of how tired he looks. This isn't the behaviour of a comfortable individual. As such, to bring things back to the topic of controlling Thomas, every movement feels extremely hesitant, as if he expects that at any given moment his next step could be one that results in a sudden agony or terror, which, as the game will soon show you, can end up being a very accurate suspicion. While the first few beats of the game seem quiet and uneventful, you will soon come to notice things. For example, some of the paintings that litter the house offer some strikingly morbid scenes, such as a starving or wounded man apparently begging, a young girl being approached by a figure wielding an axe, or just straight up presenting an execution by hanging. It also doesn't exactly help that the large family portrait that you can in fact zoom in on hardly depicts a warm, loving environment, but this does actually stay reasonably true to family portraits of the time. If you search through some of these, it's clear that the era was far more concerned with the depiction of a family strength or pride, as opposed to the carefree photos of today that you would naturally see on social media or any such outlets. Continuing on, you will also come across a bookmark page of Latin verses, which when translated into English reveals itself to be Psalm 22 of the Book of David, a series of writings found within the third section of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to have any extensive knowledge or familiarity with the Bible, because the fact is I really don't. But Psalm 22 begins with a very crystal clear cry for help. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Regardless of your own relationship with the Bible or its contents, it's undeniable that Psalm 22 is an individual begging for rescue, praying that God will save them from whatever torment they face. But whether or not it was Thomas that actually bookmarked this page, it still offers plenty of food for thought. If it was Thomas, we know infinitely more about him. His nervous personality traits become amplified, transforming into genuine horror at his apparent situation, which then becomes a question of why? We've only just been introduced to Thomas at this point, so why has this character been driven to such a plea? And speaking of the why, if it wasn't Thomas's doing, who bookmarked the page? And again, why? These are some of the questions and notes that creep in slowly throughout the first chapter of the game. And yeah, it might be a little ham-fisted of me to focus on a Bible verse so much when ultimately again, I know very little about it. But this is just one piece of a continuously evolving puzzle, because as you've probably already guessed if you haven't read up anything or seen anything on the game previously, Thomas doesn't just experience one nightmare. He's awoken to in fact become trapped in another, and then another, and then eventually another. And so begins the literal meaning of the title, Neverending Nightmares. Now, I have a habit of warning you about spoilers and playing the game first, and this video is going to be no different, because if you haven't already, you should absolutely play this game first. So much of what I'm about to tell and show you is going to effectively shatter the impact that this game can have on a first-time player, and it's also for this exact reason that I am actually extremely grateful to have seen next to nothing of the game throughout the years. Sure, I caught the odd glimpse of it through some horrible screenshot or thumbnail, but compared to actually viewing a Let's Play and spoiling the experience for myself, this felt like a small piece of a far larger puzzle. Because, as already noted in the introduction, this game scared me sometimes, and far more than I expected it to. As a huge fan of horror media, I don't think I can consider myself someone who scares easy anymore, or at the very least not in a manner that would offer much of a lasting effect. Sure, a well-executed jump scare will startle me if done right, and there are plenty of those that I could probably think of, but genuine fear is different, something that is far more subjective, as one person's fear can easily become something entirely different to somebody else. As for me, I can't deny that a lot of the subject material explored throughout horror fascinates me, and to truly experience a film, game or book that can root itself deep and hit all the right notes to legitimately scare me is not something that comes around very often anymore. And as for Neverending Nightmares, this does happen on occasion, and it's for this reason that it truly sucks that I'm going to have to criticize some of it, because Neverending Nightmares is not perfect, but it comes so fucking close at times. The nightmares of the game are continuously embellished with eerie hums and unnerving crackles, or vicious instances of environmental sounds in the distance. I could say so much about the brilliance of this game's sound design, and for the record, as the game warns you at the very beginning, Neverending Nightmares is an experience that is infinitely more immersive when wearing headphones. So, to cycle back to some of the game's most effective scares, this is clearly an element to Neverending Nightmares that deserves praise, although it also can't be ignored that there are a few that have drawn criticism. Eventually you will come across a number of slightly different stealth sections, be it needing to hide in a wardrobe from a giant Akira baby, remaining stationary so that the blind monster can't hear you, or avoiding a teleporting killer doll. And for the most part these sections are functional, but can become quite tiresome when considering the game's somewhat cumbersome controls. It's very easy to reach a point of frustration when all you really want to do is proceed, but are instead forced to wait out the passing of a monster that seemingly drags its heels with each and every step. But here's the thing, a lot of the time you can't help but wonder if this was the developer's intent all along. Now, I've deliberately refrained from mentioning the comments of lead designer Matt Gilgenbach for 2 reasons, and one of those is that in all honesty, if you're familiar with Neverending Nightmares, you've probably already heard the buzz that focused on Gilgenbach's inspiration for the game's design, of how he used his own struggles with depression and obsessive compulsive disorder to amplify the effectiveness of Neverending Nightmares. It was something that a lot of people talked about when the game was released, so simply repeating this information for the mere sake of raising this video's credibility wasn't exactly what I had in mind when considering making it. There are plenty of other studies on the effects of OCD that are likely to be far more educationally informed than myself. I'd much rather recommend that you watch those instead. That being said, the second reason I've refrained mentioning it up to this point is because I do want to focus on a few specific points that Gilgenbach raised in an interview with GameSpot, that he wanted the game to feel bleak and hopeless, and that if the team were to implement a running mechanic, they would then also need to hinder this with a corresponding endurance mechanic, which has been appropriately identified as a persistent case of asthma. Simply put, Thomas can't run for shit. He tires within seconds and keels over, wheezing and panicking after being pushed to do something that is clearly very, very far from his comfort zone, and it is blatantly obvious how intentional this is. For the very same reason that many would come to criticise James Sunderland's clunky, awkward controls and combat ability, this is literally a mechanic designed to piss you off, to aggravate you, and then use your own aggravation against you. And I've got to be honest, there was a point during the latter half of Neverending Nightmares where I'd simply had enough. I wanted the game to end, because to willingly subject myself to the game was not only going to mean witnessing some fantastic examples of horror, it was also going to mean further infuriating controls, and as a result some frankly dull stealth sections, because at the game's worst moments, controlling Thomas is a literal exercise in mind-numbing exhaustion, and yet I wouldn't have it any other way. Just like James Sunderland, Thomas is an exhausted character, so the decision to create a gameplay experience that reflects that makes a lot of sense. You might not like it, and in some ways neither did I, but this is who Thomas is. And to have instead offered players the fluid, smooth-sailing gameplay of a 2D adventure platformer would have simply shattered the atmosphere. And as many a reviewer have already touched on before me, the atmosphere is where this game truly excels, helped in no small part by the simmering story that very, very slowly comes to light, one that offers all the context and emotional beats you could ask for to understand Thomas, at least on a surface level. However, when it comes to what actually caused him to fall into such a deep well, this really depends on you. Neverending Nightmares does in fact have 3 endings, which are determined by the player's actions. And in what seemed an extremely fitting conclusion to my first playthrough, the one I ultimately landed on was also the most depressing, but don't get me wrong, I mean this in a positive manner. After seeing all 3, I actually can't help but feel that the band ending is also the one that seems to be the most appropriate.
Gabby, what's going on?
There is a lot of environmental storytelling throughout this game. And while I love it, I also must now admit that I'm not going to cover Neverending Nightmares' story. For starters, I don't want to full on spoil it. I really do think that you should play this game as blind as possible, even if after seeing this video. But also, to actually talk about this game's story in the detail it deserves would probably have resulted in a Night in the Woods length review. I even started a few pages on it and then quickly realised that if I did that, this was probably going to be the only video I upload in the next month. And it's also worth noting that if I'm being completely honest, I've covered pretty much all the gameplay that Neverending Nightmares actually offers, aside from exploring the environments, focusing on some supposedly important items and imagery that aren't actually at all obvious as to why they're important until much later, and then avoiding monsters. That's it. You could even liken some of this game's pacing and structure to a 2D walking simulator, and I don't think saying this is much of a stretch. It's not necessarily a negative element to Neverending Nightmares, but it is one that I couldn't help but noticing in the latter half of the game. So, I have a confession. I actually really struggled to write this one. I have no idea why, but the more I worked on it, the more I found myself staring at the keyboard and having to force myself to type. But as I got to the end of the script, I realised that this internal battle couldn't have been more appropriate for the material I was covering. This channel, if anything else, is a much needed outlet for me, It allows me the opportunity to put words out there, and sometimes a kind soul will be amazing enough to resonate with them, and hey, after such a stupid shitty year, that really matters. So thank you. As for Neverending Nightmares, sure I've cut things short a little by avoiding the story, but regardless of a few gripes, I really can't help but recommend the hell out of this game. It's a brilliant example of horror, and an experience that by design really wants to get under your skin and stay there. Yeah, it has some issues, and a lot of these issues have either been mentioned by me or the ton of previous reviewers, but I still adored my time spent with this game. So, there's nothing else really to say except go play it.